Welcome to chapter 19, where we are going to look at exchange rate and specifically how output, interest rate, and exchange rate are connected. It's going to be a super interesting chapter. If you remember one thing from this entire chapter, it would be that in an open economy, so far we have now, chapter 17 onwards, looked at open economy, the effects of monetary and fiscal policy can differ significantly depending on the exchange rate regime. Yeah. So depending on the exchange rate regime, the impact can be very different. So before we look at different types of exchange rate regimes, which is in the topic of the next chapter, let's look at how does exchange rate actually get impacted, right? Because that's an important connection here that we want to look at. If let's say a fiscal policy changes through reduction in taxes, increase in government spending, or if monetary policy changes with increase in interest rate, decrease in interest rate, how does that impact the exchange rate, the currency of the country? So that's the topic of this chapter. Yeah. And then once we know this, then we can connect that to how the exchange rate regime, fixed exchange rate, floating exchange rate, how those two are connected once we understand the exchange rate impact. Yeah. So this is a new concept that is introduced in this chapter, which is interest parity condition. To think about this intuitively, think about it this way. Let's say United States and India, there are two countries. Yeah. If there is a higher interest rate in United States than let's say in India, then no one will invest in India. They'll be like, hey, I'm going to go invest in United States, assuming that all investors care about is highest return. They don't, we fact there's a factor of risk that we've not talked about, but assuming if you just care about the highest return, you would put $0 in India, you put all the dollars in US if you expect higher return. So this cannot continue. Higher return in one country, lower return in another country. So what happens is, as there's higher return in this country, flows start to go towards that country, right? And it will keep going until there's some sort of a parity or some sort of a balance. That's what interest parity condition is, right? So it's telling us some way to think about what is my exchange rate going to be, and the connection there between what that balance comes through is through the exchange rate changes. Yeah. So that's where exchange rate comes in. Exchange rate that I expect is going to be dependent on expected exchange rate, my local currency, uh, uh, where the interest rate that I'm having in my local country, and interest rate in the foreign country. Yeah. So you start to see that what you expect the exchange rate to be uh, determines your exchange rate today. And the interest rate today determines your exchange rate today. Interest rate in the foreign country determines your exchange rate today, right? So we've derived this in the previous chapter, this entire interest parity condition. But this is what is new that we're going to use, yeah? Which is how we can, for a given interest rate, find out the exchange rate, yeah, where there is parity, yeah. So I is equal to I star, and we get all of these data points where we get parity. And so here, if you're given an interest rate I, you can find out this point A and then go down and find out the exchange rate for it. Yeah. Similarly, if you're given an interest rate here, you would get the exchange rate here. So similarly, you get this line that is the relationship arrived through interest parity relationship. Yeah. So you get given exchange rate, given interest rate. So now we're able to connect interest rate to exchange rate. Yeah. And so that's the key new insight here, which is it tells us how the current exchange rate, E, depends on the domestic interest rate, I, and foreign interest rate, I star, and expected future exchange rate, E raised to E. Yeah, that's this relationship, interest parity relationship. An increase in domestic rate leads to an increase in exchange rate because in the numerator. Yeah. And so what happens is your exchange rate increases or it appreciates. Yeah, it becomes stronger. So they're all synonyms: exchange rate appreciating, increase in exchange rate, interest rate becomes stronger, right? So your domestic currency became stronger, yeah, through the exchange rate of higher increase in interest rate. Similarly, opposite for increase in foreign interest rate leads to a lower exchange rate or depreciation of your local currency. Yeah, and similarly, an increase in expected future exchange rate. Yeah, if expected future exchange rate lead goes up, then all of a sudden you also have an increase in the current exchange rate. Yeah, and what we want to keep in mind is we understand how I impacts E, I star impacts E, E expected impacts E, but in the long run, due to interest parity, yeah. So this changes happen as these interest rates are changing and currency appreciates, depreciates. But this is the key: in the long run, due to interest parity, the increased depreciation has to have a reverse effect. Meaning, if it is appreciated, then it will keep up, the appreciation will continue as long as the flows, will make the exchange rate go down, right? So if it has appreciated, it will depreciate. um, Otherwise you will have an arbitrage condition, meaning this is the country that will continuously give you higher return than another country, then that lives arbitrage and no one will invest in one country. So exchange rate appreciation in the short run will lead to eventually depreciation in the long run, is the parity condition. Yeah, but there are some limits here because we see that we saw how in the situation of Brazil from 2000 to 2015, the net money flow out was much higher as a percentage of GDP. This is the net purchase of equities, Brazilian equities from 2000 to 2015. It was as high before the 2008 crisis to 25% of GDP, which is really massive, meaning people are just pumping in money in Brazil. It went down all the way down to 30% plus to minus 25% negative. And so that is hugely negative, right? And so flows may not completely agree because there are some irrational movements that can happen where people just don't care about parity. They care about risk at some point. And then so this was a flight to safety in some sense, where a lot of people, I'm guessing, including Brazil, moved money out to safe havens like the United States. So that is huge, and that's also a limit on parity condition. An example that tells you when it doesn't always work, right? You might give better interest rate in Brazil, but there's risk situation. People don't care about that higher interest rate. They really want to dump out and move to a much safer situation until situation stabilizes. Yeah. So that's the limits on parity during crisis scenario, which we also need to deeply understand. So in this chapter, we're gonna look at our ISLM model that we have in investment savings, liquidity preference, and money supply ISLM model that we've learned, and we're gonna extend it to the open economy and connect that to exchange rate. That's the key. So if you remember, um, we had Y output as a function of consumption, investments, government spending, imports, and exports. Yeah, and we also derived in the previous chapter how it's positively dependent on consumption, positively dependent on investments, positively dependent on, again, the income, or how much people invest depending on the income or the output, and negatively on interest rates. So I'll put the signs here, and then positively again on output. Positively depends on the there's more imports. You will import more if your output goes up. Yeah, and at the same time, you will have exchange rate that's favorable, right? Similarly, foreign income increases, right, will lead to better exports, so positive export. But exchange rate has a negative impact on export. Yeah, so if you have a currency that is appreciated, then export will become harder, less competitive, right? So that's these signs. We've covered all of this in the previous chapter, but we wanted to quickly recap. Now if we combine net exports and say, hey, exports minus imports, we call it net exports, then we can rewrite this equation in a much shorter form, and we can say, hey, net exports depends on output, local output or local income, foreign output, and exchange rate. Yeah, so it's just combining these two into one. And then if we assume real exchange rate equals to nominal exchange rate, real interest rate equals nominal interest rate. Remember, we do these assumptions primarily to really deeply understand what the model is in the most simplified form so that we can find out, all else being equal, meaning in this case we are assuming real interest rate equals nominal interest rate, meaning pi inflation equals zero, right? So we just say we're making some hard assumptions so that we understand how this system works for just changing one variable at a time, because in complex scenario, which would need a pretty detailed macroeconomic model to not have all of these limiting assumptions. That's how it's done in real life. But for us to understand some of these concepts, we'll have to have simplifying situations, and that's what these assumptions do. They actually make it easier for us to understand one thing at a time, and all of them can work together. Like, you don't have to expect inflation to be zero or nominal exchange rate equals real exchange rate, right? But for that, you can't do it on this tiny screen, right? So continuing to build on this, we can, if we rewrite this, we got this equation, yeah. Y is a function of consumption, investments, government spending, right? And then what I've done here, the difference is I've changed R to I. Look at that, because now you can talk in nominal terms and not real terms, because as we talked about in the previous chapters, it's very hard for a lot of people to think about in real terms. So let's convert that into nominal terms, and also nominal terms in terms of exchange rate. So that's the rewritten part. And if we did that, then we can arrive at the ISLM model, and in substituting the interest parity condition, we can then connect that to um, if you add the interest parity condition that we just learned and substitute E with 1 plus I expected exchange rate over 1 plus I star, interest rate locally, domestically to interest rate foreign, and then we also factor that in. That just helps us replace this formula here, and then we get this ISLM modified model, which we call the Mundell Flemming model, right? It gives us this key insight that is new, which is the increase in interest rate I, nominal interest rate I, has a direct effect on investment. We see that, we already knew that, but it also has a secondary effect through the exchange rate. Yeah, so that's the key insight here, which is it impacts net exports in a pretty big way. So interest rate um, impacts investments, also impacts net exports through the factor of exchange rate. That's the connection. We're connecting interest rate to exchange rate here, and so it changes the exchange rate through this scenario. Yeah, so that is the indirect secondary effect of raising interest rate. That's the key new thing that we really need to understand deeply. Yeah, so that's the interest parity that we talked about and introduced previously. So now if we were to put it visually, this is our ISLM curve. That remains the same. And then what we do now is for a given interest level I, yeah, I bar, we can actually find out the corresponding equilibrium exchange rate. So that's the new connection here, the Mundell Flemming model. I hope I'm not butchering his name. Mundell or Mundell Flemming model, right? Gives us in the ISLM situation for a given I the exchange rate. That's the key connection here. And so what we can clearly also tell is that an increase in interest rate reduces output, right? If you were to increase interest rate here, output would go down to much lower, directly reduces output, but also indirectly through exchange rate. So what happens is exchange rate becomes stronger. When exchange rate becomes stronger, what happens is your you are able to import more but export less, right? So if your exchange rate um, becomes competitive or much stronger, then what happens is a lot of your customers who you are exporting to now has to shell out more of their local currencies to buy your dollar. Yeah. So that's the key takeaway, and we'll see this visually as well. So let's look at this one more time. If there's an increase in interest rate, yeah, I goes to I dash. So Federal Reserve, let's say, decides they want to increase the nominal interest rate. Yeah. So they do that. Its LM curve shifts up. We know clearly why um, um, y hat goes to y, right? So if I goes to I dash, a goes to a dash, and y hat goes to y. Similarly, and that happens primarily because I had gone to I dash here, which is the same situation here. Exchange rate appreciates, yeah. And so what we see is that there's a decrease in output, y dash becomes y, and an appreciation of currency, e becomes e dash, right? So that we can now very clearly connect as to what's happening with change in interest rate. Similarly, if the government decides to not do monetary policy like the previous example, or no change in interest rate, but they're saying, hey, I'm going to increase government spending, and they're saying no change monetary policy, no interest rate change. So what then happens is the if the spending goes up, right, or they have a tax cut, similar situation, then what we see is that the IS curve shifts to the right, and we see an increase in output, but there's no change in the exchange rate because the interest rate remains the same. Yeah. So increase in output at no change in exchange rate. Yeah. But now, if we combine both of them, saying, hey, government wants to do increase in spending, and the monetary policy, the Federal Reserve decides, hey, I'm going to actually increase the interest rate as well, right? So what happens is IS curve shifts to the right, and so A would become A dash, so output would go up significantly. But then if they increase interest rate, just to slow down the economic activity, then Y dash goes back to Y double dash, right? So in a sense, what happens is exchange rate depreciates, yeah, in this scenario. Actually, sorry, appreciates. Yeah, it goes from A to A dash, so E to E double dash. Yeah. Um, so output increases not as much. If there was no increase in interest rate, it would have gone up much more, and maybe goes above potential. And that's why maybe the Federal Reserve is worried, and they might want to cool down the economy by increasing the interest rate, and then the exchange rate appreciates. So Trump tariffs, that's the key thing that we could analyze from his first presidency. And we see that there are a lot of things that happened during this time. So it's hard to say whether tariffs increase or decrease trade deficits, but there's clearly there were tariffs that were put in 2018, 2019, in the first presidency, and now in 2025. New tariffs are being put in. But what we see clearly is that, folks, net exports as a percent of GDP became worse, meaning we had a much worse deficit. And again, remember, this is post also the COVID crisis, but the tariffs came in here, right? And we are still, out of the COVID crisis, but if you look at our trade balance, it's much worse than what it was before. It was around 2.5, minus 3 to 2.5%. Now it's still below 3.5% as of this chart. And so what we see is that the deficit increased sharply, which is not a good thing, right? You can think about this as um, the overall trade balance. There was more imports than there were exports, which is not what the um, intended action was at that time, which is to have a balance. So this is an important aspect, is to look at numbers to really find out what has happened. But remember, these tariffs were implemented in 2019, and these numbers have gone down. But we need to really understand tariffs quite well. But this is, if you were to look at it from a longer term perspective, this is where these tariffs came in. It went down, and the current number is around minus 3.1%. So still worse than what it was before starting. So it's close to, somewhere here, but the numbers were slightly much better for maybe 5 years before the presidency. Yeah. And so that is where we need to look at what else has happened in aggregate. But maybe tariffs was not it, but that was not sufficient, whatever it was done, or in the magnitude of all else that was happening around the situation, that the numbers are still -3%, which is not what it was before, which is around 2.5-ish percentage. Yeah, somewhere here. Yeah. So let's understand this from this table, because there could be a lot of things that happen if Trump decides to put tariffs uh, on imported goods. What do you think happens to those people who are exporting to the United States, right? So let's just make it simple: U.S. and China. If there's no tariffs, let's say Chinese exporters were exporting $100 to US, so Chinese get $100, and US consumers who are actually going to pay the price, and businesses, right? Consumers and businesses will pay the price of $100 that'll go to the Chinese. So there's balance, zero trade balance. So there's no tariffs, and let's assume that's what was happening. $100 was 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 given um, from U.S. consumers to the Chinese exporters, right? So here you could say, so here you could say that the price is no tariffs, so there's no one paying tariff, but the consumer, the business is actually paying $100 to China. But we didn't get like China importing from the United States. It's just one way for now, just make it easier. But now assume that there's tariffs put in, yeah, and they say for every $100 item that we import from China, we're gonna put in $25 of tariff. So the U.S. consumer has to, consumer, when I say consumers, consumer businesses, they have to pay $125 because $25 of tariffs added. So who's paying for this is the U.S. consumer, $25. If the $100 was what was exported from China and it had $25 bill, and the U.S. consumer says, I need all of that item, I'm going to pay 125. So the U.S. Government makes 25, the Chinese still at 100. Okay? So who ended up paying more money? The U.S. consumer compared to what they were paying before. It could also be that a Chinese exporter decides, hey, there's a 25% tariff, so they'll still, United States still pays, the same price that it was before. So 25% on $80 gets them, um, the U.S. consumer still pays $100, and the 20 goes to the government. Here, the 25 went to the government, and 80 goes to the Chinese exporter. So you clearly see that the Chinese exporter, suffered some here. The U.S. consumer did not suffer, didn't pay the extra tariff, but the U.S. government also made $20, right? The difference between the two. So there are various scenarios, and I just looked at one way, one flow as to who's paying. Remember, these goods and services could have different elasticities. And so depending on how elastic these items are, depending on what these countries do on US exports, there are so many factors that can actually impact how the tariff scenario actually plays out. I've given a few scenarios here, but in a sense, tariffs make imports more expensive. We just saw this here. When you add a tariff, it just makes it expensive, and the government makes some money off of that, $25 here and $20 here in this scenario. Yeah. So, but imagine when the United States decided to add 25% tariff. This is this hypothetical scenario. There could be a tariff war. The Chinese says, okay, for every 20, if you put out 25% tariff on all my $100 goods, I'm going to put a 25% on all of the things that I import from you. So what happened to trade balance? No impact, right? So trade is reduced overall between the two countries, but trade balance, it's still, the government's making some money, and in this case, U.S. consumer pays, the Chinese consumer pays, and overall net, what happened? Yeah, so if you look at import and exports together, you will see that the United States will end up paying for it by exporting less, or in some way making less money in the exports, which they try to make more money in imports. So if there's a tariff war, then you have to see that exporting country can do several things. As I show you here, we take some. This is a scenario where exporting country takes a hit. Also, they would depreciate their currency. So all of a sudden, the currency depreciation makes it such that it's now cheaper to buy those goods. So them, the price still stays the same. They still have cheaper value, and so currency depreciation can come in. They can also reduce their price, as we saw here. So they can depreciate, they can do a tariff war, they can put a tariff on your exports, and so on and so forth. But in a sense, the key is of the magnitude. If the import falls more than exports, yeah, import falls more than exports, then the net exports increases, yeah, exports higher than imports, so net export increases. So when net export increases, output goes up. And so if imports don't fall compared to export as much due to trade war, then net export actually falls. Net exports can actually fall. It depends on the magnitude of increase in import and export. So you could have a situation where output decreases, which usually goes down, right, overall. So in a sense, you really want to understand how export falling because of import compared to falling imports more than exports. What happens is, if you saw in the previous slides, S curve shifts to the right. Yeah. So because there's an increase in net exports, right? And so Y increases, output increases, right? Because we saw X increases. And so when Y increases, output increases, interest rate, um, there is a chance that the reserve say, hey, output is above potential. I'm going to increase the interest rate to tame in inflation. Then interest rate has a higher chance of increasing. And when interest rate increases, what happens? We saw people want to buy those funds, so then capital flows into the country. The currency appreciates. The currency appreciates. Export falls. So look, so when export, this whole X increase started with export increases now relative to imports, but now exports falling. So you start to see a counter impact happening because of currency appreciation. Yeah, and Federal Reserve, depending on the magnitude of how much the Federal Reserve steps in to increase interest rate, this could have a pretty big impact. So to really deeply analyze the scenario as to what is the price elasticity of the goods that we are putting import and exports controls on, and who's going to pay the price, and whether the country is at potential. Because if it's at potential, and if you say, I want to boost my local production, it's going to overheat and cause inflation, and the Federal Reserve will increase interest rate. And we just saw how the cycle works. So if you didn't understand this fully, what I did is I actually prompted ChatGPT and said, hey, write this down in a very easy way. So this is a slide. You can take a picture, or pause this video, and you can see how each of these scenarios work. And I validated this, so you can actually see how this works. And it also tells you what's the net, because there's an ambiguous impact on output depending on the magnitude, depending on what other countries do. So this is a quick summary of that as well that you can refer. In essence, folks, exchange rate comes into play. Yeah, and so we're going to look at how the impact of monetary and fiscal policy affect the overall economy, and how it depends significantly on the exchange rate and exchange rate regime. Next up, we will look at chapter 20. That's going to be also a super interesting chapter. And I have this really good image you see here. They are actually, discussing exchange rate on an island. Looks like Hawaii. So that's going to be interesting. So the next chapter is exchange rate regimes, and we understood exchange rate in connection to interest rate in this video. And next up, we'll wrap up with exchange rate regime. That concludes the open economy extension from everything that we've learned previously. And I'll see you on in the next one. Thank you. Bye.